Hey there folks, how's it going? RedMaster here, and welcome back to another video on the channel. Now, if you are, a returning viewer here, you pretty much understand where the game Cards and Castles is in. It hasn't really been updated in a long time. It doesn't plan to receive any updates as a sequel is nearing completion, but that does not stop players from enjoying the game, and it certainly has not stopped since when we first stopped getting updates back in 2018. The game has been continually pushing on, somewhat evolving as the years go forward, with new ideas and decks kind of coming to light, and some of them taking power in the metagame. But with that being said, there are also new players who happen to stumble on the game. It's not just the older players, obviously, that are enjoying the product here. There are folks who discover it for the first time and obviously enjoy the game and stick around, play a few matches. And some of those new players want to learn more about the game. And they ask questions. And one of those questions is, how do they properly spend their shards? Where should they invest those shards? Well, we're going to answer that question today. We're going to be looking through each of the factions in the game and pinpointing what epics and legendary cards that you, potentially as a new player or even maybe a returning player looking for some advice, can go to in order to improve your decks and improve your matches. Now, before I do get started with this, do keep in mind that there are a lot of cards that are considered strong in the game. However, some of those cards come at even common, basic, or rare slots, which realistically, you can invest shards into those if you want to. But my philosophy is that, it's always better to save for the higher end stuff, because those aren't the ones that you're going to be guaranteed in a bunch of packs. The game is extremely generous when it comes to pack distribution, and realistically, if you stick around with the game and give it some time, you'll easily flesh out a large collection of commons and rares, which should help you fill out some of those power cards inside of those factions. The ones that are of more lower rarity, things like, Freezing Pillar, Lumberjack, the global buffs of Armory Blacksmith. Those are some power examples of some cheap cards, which, again, hopefully you should fill out if you stick around and play the game for long enough. I would go over pretty much every card, however, that's already been done before. I think we've got a list for that, which I will link below. I think it's Jump and Crates list, which is still pretty accurate to this day. But I will leave that below in case you want to check out some other power cards that might be within the lower rarity factions. But you want to get to the big stuff. So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the power cards you should invest in. So first up, we have the Viking cards. Now, for this faction, I've got two cards that you should focus your investments on, and those two are, of course, Lightning Blade and Yenneroth the Frozen. We'll start off with the big boy, the Yenneroth here, and why I recommend investing in him. Of course, a big boy on its own at the 6/8 stat line, but people more so use this card for its ability to freeze off the entire board. Now, the freeze mechanic is certainly a pain for players to deal with, being able to not move or attack at all for a turn with their units here. So imagine that across all targets. It's certainly going to be frustrating for opponents to deal with. Not only that, but it's a great way for Viking players to set up proper positionings for Chain, not only from Lightning Blade, a card on here, but as well as Yarm Giant, a big boy who can, of course, slap the board for some big multiple chain procs to do a lot of damage and even maybe clear the board if used correctly. Not only that, but of course his freeze can be procced multiple times with Mystic Journey. So of course, if you are putting out Yenneroth here and need another turn or so, you can of course use Mystic Journey on the Yenneroth, refreeze the board, and move your units into a proper position. It's an incredible annoying card, and usually I also add this to Yenneroth, that when he comes out, there are some points where your opponent will have low resources. If you throw a Yenneroth down and rush it to attempt the remaining bits of damage of, say your opponent's on maybe like 4 castle HP. If you rush Yenneroth down, it's very difficult for your opponent to respond to because it is a big dragon. They need either a direct removal spell, something like Mercenary's Execution, or hope to draw some kind of out because they know they can't use any other aspect of their board. It's frozen off. So certainly annoying for Yenneroth to hit the board at the just damnedest of times, but of course that's a great reason why you should invest if you are looking for that kind of card. Following that, though, you do have Lightning Blade, which is the other sort of Viking staple, I would say. Usually in most Viking decks, you tend to find these two cards as absolutely must-plays. Whether it's, a 2 or 3 copies, depends on the deck or the space, but I digress. You do have Lightning Blade here. What makes Lightning Blade so worthwhile? Well, of course, it's a nice little stat boost. That 2/2 can be very useful, especially in a game where a lot of things rely on the sort of global buff aspect. Having big units means you are winning the game in a somewhat way. But not only that, you do have the Chain Lightning attached to the Lightning Blade. Sure, it's only for a turn, but that is usually all you need. The Chain is one of the highest raw Chain Lightning values outside of Ragnar, which is at 5, but Ragnar in itself is a whole nother monster. Lightning Blade, the reason why it's sort of, the more must-have over something like Ragnar is because, well, it can be chained onto anything that you want it to on the board. Having that chain is just very, very crucial when you are dealing with, maybe some more back row focused decks, things like the School of Knowledge decks that, have a lot of buildings. Or if you want to snipe off maybe a ranged unit that's hiding in the back, Lightning Blade is useful as well. Or if you want to just flat out end the game, Lightning Blade is an easy way for you to pick up some additional damage in a very effective way and just slap castle. It's got a lot of sort of utility that I think a lot of Viking decks love to take advantage of, and having Chain in any deck is certainly scary. It forces your opponent to be more aware of their positioning, which is why usually in that Viking matchup, you'll have players be a little more cautious about where they move their units. Say that you're obviously running a Viking deck, for example, and of course your opponent is playing something like Awaken. You'll notice that most of the time that Awaken deck will of course keep things sort of disconnected. Maybe it may not be optimal for them to be there, but they'll move in that sort of way. They're playing around things like Lightning Blade. They don't want the chain to completely wipe out their draw engine, like, say they have a dojo in the back. If they lose that dojo, they're done, and if they don't want that to be connected through the Lightning Blade through any means, so that's essentially why people tend to play around with their positionings when facing off against Viking decks. So it's a very crucial card to have for Viking decks, to be sure. But with that being said, I think Yenneroth and Lightning Blade are definitely some key cards to pick up. But what about the next faction here, the Crusaders? And next up, we do slide right into the Crusader faction. And realistically, I only have one card that I wish to share as sort of a high investment target, and that target is Craxus, God of the Arena. It's an incredible card, no doubt about it. There is so much packed into this one card that makes it a must-have for various Crusader decks. Where to begin? From the fact that it has a deflect, so of course, very spell immune, things like burn or removal can't hit it, to the armor, a regenerating little health bonus, to the victory draw that is absolutely insane and can absolutely swing games if used properly. It is incredible how much over the years I've seen Craxus be able to just take game from an absolutely losing position. And it's one of those swing cards that I think if you are running Crusaders, you must try to fit at least a copy or two into your deck. It's just so good. And of course, the deflect means that, while your opponent's spells can't really hit it, yours can. So things like Craxus Voltron can be real if you, want to go that direction. But realistically, I think Craxus is fine as a sort of supporting staple. And I think it's just great for any, deck to have. A big body pairing off with an incredible draw engine that can get you all the cards you need in sort of the blink of an eye. So really, that's just why I have Craxus as the only Crusader card on my list anyway. There is an argument to go around that say, well, what about Arbiter's Return, the 9 gold healing that gets you a judge for a turn? That's fine, but I do think the Hands of the Saint is a nice, more budget-friendly option for players who don't want to spend any of their shards to craft Arbiters. Arbiters is certainly a great card to have, don't get me wrong, but there is that option in Hands of the Saint that, while it doesn't provide you with a Judge, I still think it's an incredible way to at least guarantee the deck has some form of healing or some way to kind of bounce back your health from a potentially losing situation. But with that being said, that's all for the Crusaders. Let's go ahead and move on to Pirates. Alright folks, and following along, we move right into the Pirate faction. Again, I've got two options for you. You've got, of course, the One-Eyed Maddie and the Southport Captain. Honestly, both these cards are pretty good, just generically strong all around. You might be wondering, though, to yourself, if you're newer Red, why go with Maddie here? And you'll see in just a moment, as we've got this cool little trick that, yeah, One-Eyed Maddie up there, you're going to see he's going to pop out a Dark Bender for free. Maddie has an incredible way of creating some weird value for anyone who kind of throws him in the deck. You also have a wide variety of mages that he chooses from. Honestly, the mage pool is probably one of the most OP pools inside of the game, just in terms of randomness, with things like Headwood, Wizard, Darkbender, Tarius, all included, plus more. There's a reason why people like throwing Maddie. It gives their deck access to a whole new power that is otherwise sort of locked by faction restrictions. Whether that's Tarius's draw, the pure strength of Darkbender, the freeze of Lich, so many ways that you can sort of abuse Maddie inside of a deck. Now, granted, they're not all guaranteed, but usually your options are very strong with Maddie. Even the ones that aren't so strong, things like the Mage Apprentice and the Saurus, depending on what deck you run, that could be quite useful. Saurus, if you're running a lot of Awaken stuff, can repop those Awaken effects for you for free. Those Mage Apprentice can give you a free spell with that Awaken ability of his own. There's a lot to go around inside of that pool, and I think that just makes Maddie an absolute must-have for pirate decks. And following that, you do have the Southport Captain in the rear. Now, with Captain, again, stat-wise, may not be the best as a 2-3. With global buffs, that can be a little bit stronger here, but what you really want to use Southport Captain for is his sort of ramp, that instant gain treasure when played ability. Unfortunately, it can't be Mystic Journey repeated like the Yenneroth ability was, but this is still a pretty strong ability regardless, because Southport can easily ramp you up into a big turn from sort of a smaller position, i.e. you play Southport Captain turn 3, you now have access to a turn 4 Minotaur. That's sort of the classic way we look at that. That's how, you know, useful that ramp is. And of course, it's all guaranteed. You don't have to keep Southport alive. You can use him defensively or offensively as an additional threat to the board alongside that ramp. It's just very good for creating those big treasure moments, whether they're late game or early game. Early game, you ramp out something like a Minotaur. Late game, you ramp out something like a Mordok Scope or a Dremoth. That's just how useful the Southport ramp is, and it's probably one of the best ramps inside of the game currently. So these two are, you know, again, must-haves for pirate decks, but that, of course, quickly brings us into our next faction, the Warlocks. Now, funny enough, just like with the Crusader faction, I really only found one card that you can maybe put more of a priority on than some of the others inside of the Warlock faction, and that card is Dragon's Fire. I don't know why I pointed that way when it's clearly that way, but mirror imaging. Anyway, Dragon's Fire, of course, the biggest sort of board wipe, or the most notorious board wipe currently inside of the game. For 6 gold, you just deal 3 damage to every enemy unit across the board here. Now, of course, it's extremely useful when you have a lot of decks that rely on some smaller token creatures or have small units as their core strategy here. Dragon's Fire is a instant way to just clean up the board and proceed with the rest of the game. Kind of like a reset button for some players to kind of fall back on if things go south. It's incredibly useful just to, again, establish that control over the board here, and really there's not much else to say about it than it simply being a just very useful board wipe and one of the most reliable ones out there. Now, of course, the issue that Dragon's Fire has over something like Flamestorm is, of course, it can't pierce buildings, so when things like global buffs start to come out, it kind of makes the Dragon's Fire a little less valuable. But if you can focus on burning off or getting rid of some of those buildings beforehand, the Dragon's Fire will be much more effective going through, the rest of the game, depending on what is currently on the board here. Sometimes a combination of Dragon's Fire and Flamestorm 2 turn 9 is absolutely brutal. A 5 damage board wipe to the board is certainly going to clear out a lot of things. So just, again, moving my microphone. This whole segment, the Warlock section, man, I don't know what's going on with it. But regardless, the Dragon's Fire are probably the best card to invest in for the Warlock faction as a whole. If you are looking for something in that to kind of put your shards to, Dragon's Fire is certainly the card I would put my money on. But let's go ahead and move on next into the Ninja faction. And moving right along into the Ninja faction now, to be honest, the Ninja faction was actually a bit tricky to choose some cards for, because not only do most people consider ninjas to be the weakest faction in the game currently, but a lot of their power cards are cards that actually lie within sort of the cheaper options in the commons and rares, with things like multi-strike, dissipate, and lunging attack. There are few options that I think sort of match the power that some of those cards provide, but I did choose some cards for you to look at. So with that being said, when you look at the Ninja faction, some of the best cards to invest in would be Shodan, the RedMaster, along with the Ethereal Panda. Now, these cards are pretty useful as sort of their in their own sort of way, and we'll go over that right now here. As Shodan is a generic big body that of course can be useful with whatever faction he's paired up with. Things, gaining abilities like the explosion in Warlock, the chain in Viking, the range in Pirates, the health in Crusaders, the rampage in Druid. There's a lot of things that he can be useful for, and just generally provides a nice sort of late game option to whatever deck he's included in. That gets a little bit of a bonus depending on obviously which faction he is paired up with. So that is pretty useful as well, and the movement as well. The movement is absolutely huge, of course, when you consider that a lot of units in this game take that 3 movement when they're fast movements on the board. It usually takes some importance, some significance, I should say, to the battlefield. So obviously, that is a big factor to consider there as well. Jumping on over into the Panda, though, the Panda, of course, useful in its own right as sort of being a way to provide some late game removal for the Ninja faction, which is not really prevalent inside of that faction, to be honest here. When you have removal, we're really talking about bounce cards, because of course that is a way for you to kind of reset your opponent's tempo and be more dominant over the board when you just sort of return everything that your opponent has to their hand. And obviously, we mentioned power cards before in the faction, like Dissipate. When you think of Dissipate as having the same sort of return enemy to hand type of feel, and that being powerful, then Panda certainly lines up in that same vein as being a pretty powerful card to line up with that. Not only do you return units to your opponent's hand, but you create a body on the board to kind of put yourself ahead of them, which is, again, very useful. And of course, with Panda being a initiative effect, you can not only repeat this ability with things like Mystic Journey, but you could also, of course, bounce Panda to your hand inside of your own Ninja faction and reuse that ability again to create sort of this very Panda control-esque type of gameplay that I think for most people going up against that, very frustrating indeed. So certainly something to consider if you are looking to play in the Ninja faction. However, more cards that we have to get to, so let's go ahead and jump right in to the Druids next. And we move into Druids for our next faction. And to be honest, similarly to the Ninja faction, a lot of the Druid power cards that are worth looking into are cards that are at sort of the cheaper slot, the common slot more specifically. When you think of Druid power cards, most people will point to cards such as Bestial Rage, which gives that rampage to any unit, at all, actually. I almost said melee, but I don't think it has a melee restriction. But alongside the Bestial Rage, you also have the companions like Centaur and Spiny, which are great at being pests, like, or just, removing back row threats, like range units, building, etc. They're great for doing that. So when you think of, what legendary or epic cards are worth crafting, there really isn't too much, which is nice for some budget players. They don't have to worry about purchasing a lot of legendaries and whatnot. But there are 2 cards that I think are still worth crafting that are in the higher tier slot that I think might be worth players to give a look towards. And of course, those 2 cards that I'm referring to include Call for Aid and the Beastmaster, the 5 golds of the faction. I think 2 of the 3, or 2 of the 2. However the case may be. These 2 cards provide some incredible potential for the Druid faction. We'll start out with Call for Aid here. This bad boy is absolutely incredible to just be a pain. Adding 2 Northlands Rangers to your hand for 5 cost each might seem pretty dull on paper, but of course the Northlands Rangers, like the one on your screen now, you can see him walking across the bottom there, are big boys, 7-8 apiece, and of course that's not counting any sort of buffs that could be already present on the field, which can bring him up to, 8-9 or 9-10. Very, very scary stuff to have those 2 big boys charging at you. And are usually the reason that some Druid games are able to close out as effectively as they can. They've pretty much cleared out all their opponent's resources here. They follow up with a Call for Aid. They follow in with the 2 Rangers. And usually, it's very difficult to respond to at least both of them because of their high health. That is just very, very annoying to get through without hard removal or additional burn. And, yeah, it's just annoying. It really is. I haven't really know how much I've just been annoyed by Call for Aid. Whenever I think my opponent is out of resources, all of a sudden Call comes down, they rush 2 Rangers at me, and now I have to deal with that. So certainly annoying, and certainly worth looking into for your Druid decks. But following that is, of course, the Beastmaster. Now, honestly, following Call for Aid is pretty difficult to do in the Druid faction at this sort of epic and legendary slot. But Beastmaster, I think, is the card that comes closest to it. Because if you're not looking for Call for Aid in sort of the long-term, use of it, like, you use the Call for Aid, then reserve the Rangers. If you want something more immediate, you go for Beastmaster, which, of course, the initiative of bringing out 2 beasts is very, very useful, considering that in that pool includes things like Bearhawk, which have a built-in Rampage, and the Northlands Bear, which is just a big, big tank at 3-6, potentially more again with globals present on the board here. Now, Beastmaster does have a big downside to it, which of course, kills all beasts when he leaves the field, but if Druid decks can sort of avoid that sort of built-in beast, idea, they don't put a lot of beasts in their deck, usually the downside of Beastmaster is not too big for them. They just maybe lose whatever they have on board remaining from the Beastmaster, and they move on with their day. He's an effective way to virtually clear the, any early aggro from your opponent that's still lingering on the board, and can help you rebuild, to push forward for the rest of the game here. And again, the initiative effect is something to kind of keep note of, because that can not only be bounced or reused, it's just great. It can, be annoying for your opponent to deal with multiple procs of Beastmaster, just having the multiple beasts follow suit. Of course, you have to be careful with this strategy, though, because, of course, if you lose Beastmaster, all those beasts die. But if you bounce it, you can protect the beasts for, as long as you don't play Beastmaster again. So, honestly, an incredible card that I think might be overlooked because of that negative downside, the lose all beasts, which is not too bad when you know how to play around it or can incorporate your deck building to kind of, adapt to that restriction. But regardless, I digress. We have one more faction to get into, and that is going to be the neutral faction. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the final cards for this video. Alright, folks, and for some of our final cards for this video, we're going to be taking a look at two, I don't know why I said some there, but we are looking at 2 neutral legendary cards that I think are absolutely incredible for any deck to be running. And of course, those 2 cards include Mordok, the Dark Rider, and the Rat King. Now, if you guys have been playing this game for a while, you'll need no introduction on why these cards are as great as they are. But if you are newer, let's go ahead and break down why these 2 cards are incredible for any deck. We'll start out with Mordok first. Of course, Mordok is, on paper, maybe stat-wise, at the higher slot, not that great. A 4-5, the same stats as Barbarian. What, makes him so useful? It's the combo ability that makes this dude an absolute menace. The combo, which is combat, generates a random undead unit, which includes in a pool, or which pulls from, a pool of Banshee, Headless Horseman, or Wraith. There's virtually no downside to any of those pool targets. Absolutely none. With Banshee, you get a cheap 3-2 body, as well as a free spell when that Banshee dies. With the Horseman, you get a 3-1 body, along with the ability to instantly deal 3 damage to any target, or any enemy target on the board. And then you have Wraith, which is just a huge chunk at 3-8, which also can fear targets back. So if he doesn't kill them, he can, of course, buy you a little bit of time. Virtually no card in that pool is bad, and when you consider that Warlock can proc multiple times potentially to generate at least 2 or more units, there's incredible value in that alone. And of course, when you throw on the idea of, Warlock getting the Dwarven Scope, Warlock getting Rampage, being able to proc that ability multiple times is virtually what makes this guy a very, very scary threat to anyone who encounters it. And is usually why you'll see burn or direct removal instantly hit Warlock as soon as he hits the board. If he can't get a combo out, that would be a win if the burn can do it, and usually that's what people go towards because they can't afford to deal with whatever Warlock pulls. Regardless of what he pulls, it's a bad day. It's not like when you have Beastmaster in our previous example, where he has a pool of Northland's Bear, Bearhog, and Wolf. It's clear that you want to achieve not Bearhog. You want to achieve the Northland's Bear from that pool most of the time. With Mordok, you don't usually care what you get unless you're in a very specific circumstance. Whatever you get is usually going to be strong enough to deal some kind of damage to your opponent. Whether that's through the spell from Banshee, the damage from Horseman, or the absolute chunk that is Wraith. It's just annoying to deal with, and that can proc again multiple times. Your opponent is usually in for a bad time. But let's go ahead and move on and talk about the Rat King, why that is an important card to have. Obviously, the Rat King has a great defensive ability of generating those 4 rats on the summon. That in itself is a great defensive tool that a lot of players go to in the 3 gold slot in order to help them defend off against some early aggro, which can be, quite useful. But again, we do have to talk about why the initiative effect is so useful. You can reproc this multiple times, and there's room for the creation of Mystic Rats and why that's so prevalent. Usually, you'll see Viking decks tend to throw Mystic Journey everywhere, but however, because that's a rare, that's why we didn't include it in this video. And alongside that, you have Rat King, which can proc multiple pops of that Rat King summon. And you usually see global buffs hit the board at the time that you want Rat King to pop, so you'll end up having a bunch of buffed rats being spawned for 2 gold off of Mystic Journey with the Rat King. And usually the upkeep isn't too bad, because of course, if you want to get rid of the upkeep, you can of course trade in the Rat King before you do anything else to ensure that you don't have to worry about it. So Rat King has a lot of positives, and its downside can be easily avoided if your opponent or whoever plays it correctly. So Rat King, definitely a pickup, a very great defensive option, as I said, for any deck that decides to play him. And yeah, that's why Rat King is pretty strong, to be honest. And obviously there are a lot of players who I think right now in the community can put some more explanation as to why the Rat King is such a formidable card. But that is going to do it for our list today, folks. So let's go ahead and close out this video properly. Alright, and with that being said, folks, I think that is going to do it for our list today. Be sure to let me know down in the comment section if you agree or disagree with my list. And if you disagree with my list or think that a card should be included, do mention why in the comments section below. Of course, it's always great to get discussion going on these videos. It helps everyone out. It helps people kind of learn the insights as to, why some cards can be good from more veteran players. So be sure to leave some thoughts down in the comment section for people to kind of feast on, so they can form their own opinions on whether or not they think some cards may be strong or not. But of course, before you do leave the video, if you guys did enjoy it, be sure to leave a like on it if you did enjoy. Be sure to share it with your friends, and be sure to subscribe. It's the best way that you can support the channel if you're new or returning. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Again, it helps out the channel a ton. It helps us grow. We are very, very close to reaching the 1K milestone. We get closer, it feels like, every week or so. Hopefully we can make that happen before the end of the year, but we'll have to see. Well, folks, that is going to do it for me. Be sure to, do all that stuff, and I'll catch you next time. But until next time, stay gaming.